The Dorothy Eady match. In 1973, British police investigating a burglary lifted fingerprints from a broken window in London. Running them through their database for comparison, they got an unexpected hit. The prints matched a set-on file from 1904, nearly 70 years earlier. The 1904 prints belonged to a woman named Dorothy Eady, who had been fingerprinted as part of an early identification program when she applied for domestic service work. Dorothy Eady had died in 1904, just months after being fingerprinted, from pneumonia. She was 23 years old. The 1973 prints belonged to a woman named Sarah Mitchell, age 22, who lived in the same London neighborhood where Dorothy Eady had lived 7 decades earlier. Sarah had been fingerprinted during a routine background check for employment, and those prints had been entered into the modern criminal database. When police compared the two sets of prints, they found a complete match across all 10 fingers. Not similar, identical. The ridge patterns, minutia points, and distinctive features were the same. According to fingerprint science, this should be impossible. The probability of two people having identical fingerprints is calculated at approximately 1 in 64 billion, far exceeding Earth's population. Scotland Yard's Fingerprint Analysis Unit conducted extensive examination of both sets of the prints. They verified that the 1904 prints were genuine, taken using period-appropriate ink and paper, with documentation confirming Dorothy Eady's identity. The 1973 prints were unquestionably Sarah Mitchell's, taken by certified technicians using modern equipment. The examiners noted something even stranger. The prints weren't just statistically identical. They showed the same wear patterns, the same minor scars, the same distinctive features that develop through individual life experiences. Two different women, living 7 decades apart, appeared to have not just the same genetic fingerprint pattern, but the same biographical fingerprint development. Sarah Mitchell was brought in for questioning. She had no criminal record and no connection to the burglary. The match had been flagged automatically by the database during routine processing of the crime scene evidence. When investigators told her about the match to prints from 1904, she was bewildered. But then Sarah mentioned something strange. Since childhood, she'd experienced vivid recurring dreams about Victorian London. Specific streets, specific buildings, specific people. She could describe neighborhoods as they had existed in the late 1800s with accuracy that surprised historians. She'd always dismissed these as imagination, perhaps inspired by period films or books. Investigators researched Dorothy Eady's life. Records were sparse, but they found she'd worked as a housemaid in several London homes before her death. One of those homes was on the same street where Sarah Mitchell currently lived, though the original building had been demolished and replaced in the 1950s. The case was never resolved. Scotland Yard concluded that either their fingerprint uniqueness theory had a major flaw, or something more inexplicable had occurred. The burglary investigation moved forward without Sarah, who was clearly not the perpetrator. But the question of how two women separated by 7 decades could have identical fingerprints remained unanswered. Some researchers suggested reincarnation, that Sarah was Dorothy reborn, somehow carrying forward not just memories but biological markers. Others proposed that fingerprint uniqueness is overstated and that matches across time are rare but possible. Skeptics argued there must be an error in the 1904 documentation, though no evidence of such error was found. Sarah Mitchell declined further investigation, saying the experience was disturbing and she wanted to move on with her life. The matched fingerprint sets remain in Scotland Yard's files, a documented impossibility that challenges the very foundation of fingerprint identification. The Pompeii Potter. In 1982, archaeologists excavating in Pompeii uncovered a pottery workshop preserved by volcanic ash from the 79 AD eruption of Mount Vesuvius. Among the artifacts were numerous clay vessels and fragments bearing clear fingerprints, the marks left by potters as they shaped wet clay nearly 2,000 years ago. The preservation was remarkable. The volcanic ash had sealed the fingerprints almost immediately, preventing degradation. Modern forensic techniques could analyze these ancient prints with the same precision used for contemporary criminal investigations. A team of forensic archaeologists cataloged the fingerprints, creating a database of the ancient potter's distinctive patterns. They hoped to identify how many different individuals had worked in the shop and potentially understand the organization of Roman pottery production. In 1985, an Italian man named Marco Esposito was arrested for theft in Naples. As part of standard booking procedures, his fingerprints were taken and entered into the Interpol database. The database flagged an unexpected match. Esposito's prints were identical to one set of fingerprints from the Pompeii Pottery workshop. The match was across all 10 fingers. Forensic examiners compared the ancient prints lifted from pottery fragments to Esposito's modern prints. They were identical. Same ridge patterns, same minutiae points, same distinctive features. Investigators were skeptical. They suspected contamination. Perhaps Esposito had handled the artifacts during excavation or museum display, and his modern prints had been mistakenly cataloged as his ancient ones. But examination of the documentation proved this impossible. The pottery fragments bearing the matched prints had never left secure storage after excavation. Esposito had never visited Pompeii or any museum housing the artifacts. The pottery fragments were re-examined. Carbon dating confirmed they were genuine artifacts from 79 AD. The ash layers sealing the prints were undisturbed, proving the fingerprints had been made on wet clay before the eruption, then immediately preserved. Esposito was questioned about the match. He had no explanation. He'd never heard of the Pompeii pottery find. He'd never been particularly interested in ancient history. But when investigators told him his fingerprints matched those of a Roman potter from 2,000 years ago, something strange happened. Esposito described a recurring dream he'd had since childhood, working with clay, shaping vessels by hand, feeling intense heat, seeing ash falling from the sky. He'd always thought these were random nightmares, but the details matched what archaeologists knew about the final hours of Pompeii: the sudden eruption, the ash fall, the panic. Researchers investigated Esposito's family history, looking for any connection to Pompeii or the region. His family had lived in Naples for generations, just miles from Pompeii. The area had been continuously inhabited since ancient times. Was it possible his lineage traced back to survivors of the eruption? But genetic lineage couldn't explain identical fingerprints. Fingerprints aren't inherited. They're formed by random processes during fetal development, influenced by factors like amniotic fluid pressure and fetal position. A descendant would not have the same fingerprints as an ancestor. The case attracted attention from parapsychologists and reincarnation researchers. They proposed that Esposito was the reincarnation of the ancient potter, somehow carrying forward not just memories but biological markers. Skeptics argued this was pseudoscience and that the match must be a statistical anomaly or documentation error. In 1987, Esposito agreed to participate in a hypnotic regression session conducted by researchers studying past life memories. Under hypnosis, he described working in a pottery shop in Pompeii, giving details about daily life, customers, and the shop's layout. Some of these details were later verified against archaeological findings. The fingerprint match was never explained. The pottery fragments in Esposito's fingerprint records remain in Italian archives, a documented impossibility connecting a modern man to someone who lived 2,000 years ago. The Jack the Ripper connection. In 1888, London's Whitechapel district was terrorized by a serial killer known as Jack the Ripper. Despite one of history's most intensive investigations, the killer was never caught. Among the evidence collected were several letters allegedly sent by the killer, some bearing fingerprints lifted using early forensic techniques. In 2003, British police arrested a man named Thomas Harrington for assault in East London. His fingerprints were taken and entered into the UK's Ident1 database, which contains over 12 million sets of prints. The database flagged a match to prints on file from 1888, specifically prints lifted from one of the Dear Boss letters attributed to Jack the Ripper. The match was across 8 of 10 fingers. 2 fingers had been too smudged in the historical evidence for comparison. Scotland Yard's Historical Crimes Unit was immediately involved. They verified that the 1888 prints were genuine historical evidence, properly preserved and documented. The prints had been lifted from a letter sent to the Central News Agency in September 1888, one of several missives purportedly from the killer. Thomas Harrington, 34, was a warehouse worker with no criminal history beyond minor offenses. When questioned about the fingerprint match, he was shocked and insisted he had no idea why his prints would match historical evidence from over a century ago. Investigators considered several possibilities. Could Harrington have somehow contaminated the historical evidence? Impossible. The letter had been in sealed archival storage since the 1890s, accessed only by researchers under controlled conditions. Harrington had never visited the archives or handled any Ripper-related materials. Could the 1888 prints be fake, added to the letter later by a hoaxer? Forensic examination showed the prints were consistent with 1888. The ink chemistry, the paper aging, everything matched. They had been on the letter for over a century. Could this be a statistical fluke? Two unrelated people with identical prints? According to fingerprint science, no. The odds are astronomical. Investigators dug into Harrington's background. He'd grown up in East London, not far from the original Whitechapel murders. His family had lived in the area for generations. Genealogical research found that Harrington's great-great-great-grandfather had lived in Whitechapel in the 1880s. But again, fingerprints aren't inherited. A shared ancestor couldn't explain identical prints. Harrington mentioned that he'd always felt an inexplicable connection to the Whitechapel area. He described recurring dreams of walking Victorian streets at night, though the dreams were fragmentary and disturbing. He'd avoided learning about Jack the Ripper because the subject made him deeply uncomfortable. The case attracted media attention, with tabloids suggesting Harrington might be the Ripper reincarnated. This was distressing for Harrington, who insisted he was a normal person with no connection to historical murders. Parapsychologists studied the case, proposing it as evidence of reincarnation. Skeptics countered that the historical prints might have been misattributed. Perhaps they weren't from the killer, but from a police investigator or journalist who handled the letter. However, the Dear Boss letter had been analyzed extensively over the years, and the fingerprints had been cataloged as unknown suspect prints, distinct from known investigators' prints. In 2005, Harrington declined further participation in the investigation. He'd been cleared of any suspicion related to the historical crimes. Obviously, he couldn't be responsible for murders committed 115 years before his birth. But the fingerprint match remains documented and unexplained. The match prints are kept in Scotland Yard's Black Museum, now the Crime Museum, alongside other Ripper evidence. They represent either an impossible coincidence or something that challenges our understanding of identity and time. The Medieval Manuscript. In 1998, conservation workers at the British Library were restoring a 14th century illuminated manuscript, a Book of Hours created around 1350. Using modern forensic techniques to analyze the manuscript for preservation purposes, they discovered well-preserved fingerprints on several pages. These prints had been left by the manuscript's creators, monks who had handled the pages while the ink was still wet. The prints were remarkably clear, preserved in the ink and parchment for over 600 years. The British Library's Conservation Department catalogued these prints, creating a reference database for the manuscript's creators. This was standard practice for understanding how many scribes had worked on a document and their working methods. In 2001, a British woman named Catherine Holmes applied for a position with the British Library. As part of security clearance, her fingerprints were taken. When her prints were processed, the security system flagged an anomaly. Her prints matched those in the manuscript database. Specifically, Holmes's fingerprints were identical to those of one of the 14th century monks who had created the Book of Hours, a complete match across all 10 fingers. Library security immediately investigated, suspecting Holmes had somehow contaminated the manuscript. But she'd never accessed the rare books collection. She'd never been in the conservation laboratory. She'd never even visited the British Library before applying for the job. The manuscript had been in controlled storage since its acquisition in 1847. Access was restricted to authorized conservators wearing gloves. The fingerprints had been documented as historical, part of the manuscript itself, not modern contamination. Forensic document examiners verified the prints were indeed 650 years old. They had been made in iron gall ink on vellum, using materials and techniques authentic to the 14th century. The aging patterns in the ink confirmed their antiquity. When Holmes was told about the match, she was disturbed, but also intrigued. She mentioned having always felt drawn to medieval history, particularly monasteries and illuminated manuscripts. She'd studied medieval literature in university, drawn to it for reasons she couldn't articulate. Researchers investigated Holmes's ancestry, looking for any connection to medieval monasteries. Records from the 14th century were incomplete, but they found that Holmes's family likely came from the same Yorkshire region, where the manuscript was believed to have been created. But again, this couldn't explain identical fingerprints. Even if Holmes was a direct descendant of the monk who created the manuscript, she wouldn't have his fingerprints. Genetic inheritance doesn't work that way. Holmes agreed to participate in research on the phenomenon. She was shown images from the manuscript without being told which pages bore the matched fingerprints. When asked if any images felt familiar, she identified 3 of the 5 pages with the matched prints, saying they felt like something she'd seen before. Under hypnosis, Holmes described memories of a monastery, copying texts, the smell of ink and vellum, the cold stone walls. Some details matched what historians knew about 14th century monastic scriptoriums. The British Library documented the case, but declined to publicize it widely, concerned about the implications for their conservation practices. However, the matched prints were verified by multiple independent forensic examiners, all of whom confirmed the impossibility of the match. Holmes eventually took a position at a different institution, finding the situation too unsettling. The manuscript remains in the British Library's collection, with Holmes's matching prints a documented mystery in their archives. The Civil War Soldier. In 2008, a Virginia museum received a donated collection of Civil War artifacts from a private collector. Among the items was a musket, fingerprints preserved in rust on the metal, likely from a Union soldier who had carried it during the war in the 1860s. Museum conservators used modern forensic techniques to lift and preserve the fingerprints as part of the artifact documentation process. The prints were remarkably clear, preserved by the rust formation that had occurred slowly over 140 years. In 2010, a Virginia man named James Patterson was arrested for a minor offense and fingerprinted as part of the booking process. His prints were entered into the FBI's Integrated Automated Fingerprint Identification System, IAFIS, which contains over 70 million criminal records. The system flagged a match to prints in an auxiliary database that included historical and archaeological fingerprints from research institutions. Patterson's prints matched those on the Civil War musket, identical across all 10 fingers. FBI forensic examiners verified the match. They also investigated the possibility of contamination. Had Patterson handled the musket at some point, leaving modern prints? The museum confirmed the musket had been in sealed storage since donation. Patterson had never visited the museum, never handled the artifact, never had contact with it. The rust formations preserving the prints were analyzed. Metallurgists confirmed the rust was at least 100 years old, probably 140, 150 years old, based on oxidation patterns. The prints had been on the metal since the 19th century. Patterson was from Virginia, the state where the musket had been recovered. His family had lived in Virginia for generations. Genealogical research found that Patterson had an ancestor named James Patterson, who served in the Union Army during the Civil War, specifically in the same regiment that had carried that model of musket. But this ancestor, even if he'd been the soldier whose prints were on the musket, couldn't have passed his fingerprints down genetically. That's not how inheritance works. Patterson reported that he'd always had vivid dreams about the Civil War, despite having no particular interest in history. He described specific battles, the weight of equipment, the smell of gunpowder, the fear and chaos of combat. Some of these descriptions matched historical accounts with accuracy unusual for someone with no expertise. He agreed to visit the museum to see the musket. When he held it, with gloves, under supervision, he became emotional, saying it felt familiar in his hands, that he knew its weight and balance. Museum staff said his handling of the weapon showed unusual familiarity for a civilian who'd never received military training. Researchers from the University of Virginia studied the case, exploring theories of genetic memory and reincarnation. Skeptics argued there must be a documentation error somewhere. Perhaps the musket's prints weren't as old as claimed, or perhaps Patterson had handled it unknowingly at some point. But forensic verification was thorough. Multiple independent labs confirmed the print's age, the match accuracy, and the impossibility of contamination. The case remained unexplained. The musket was returned to museum display, with a notation in its documentation about the matching prints. Patterson declined further investigation, saying the experience had been unsettling and he preferred not to dwell on it. The ancient Egyptian seal. In 1975, archaeologists working in Egypt's Valley of the Kings discovered a clay seal on a storage jar in a minor tomb. The seal dated to approximately 1300 BC, over 3,000 years old. It bore the clear impression of a thumbprint, preserved perfectly in the dried clay. The thumbprint had been pressed into the clay while it was wet, likely by a scribe or official sealing the jar. The clay had then been baked hard by Egypt's heat, preserving the print in extraordinary detail. In 1978, the print was analyzed using newly developed forensic techniques that could extract minutiae points from ancient impressions. The analysis created a detailed profile of the ancient Egyptian's thumbprint. In 2012, an American tourist named Daniel Morse visited Egypt and toured several archaeological sites. At one museum, he pressed his thumb against a modern clay display showing how ancient seals were made. This was a hands-on educational exhibit encouraging visitor interaction. A museum educator, who happened to be a trained archaeologist, noticed something unusual about Morse's thumbprint in the display clay. She thought it looked remarkably similar to prints she'd seen in documentation of ancient seals. Out of curiosity, she photographed Morse's thumbprint and compared it to archived images of ancient seal impressions from various tombs. She found a match. Morse's right thumbprint was identical to the print on the 1300 BC seal from the Valley of the Kings. The comparison wasn't formally scientific at first, just a visual observation. But the archaeologist was struck by the similarity and contacted colleagues who specialized in forensic archaeology. They obtained Morse's full fingerprints, with his permission, and compared them properly to the ancient seal print. The match was confirmed. Morse's right thumbprint was identical to the 3,300-year-old print on the Egyptian seal. Same ridge patterns, same minutiae points, same distinctive features. Morse was an accountant from Ohio with no background in archaeology or Egyptology. He'd visited Egypt on vacation, his first trip to the country. He had no connection to the archaeological community, had never handled ancient artifacts, and had never visited the Valley of the Kings site where the seal was discovered. The seal had been excavated in 1975, documented immediately, and kept in controlled museum storage ever since. Morse couldn't have contaminated it. He'd been born in 1980, 5 years after the seal's discovery. When researchers told Morse about the match, he was fascinated rather than disturbed. He mentioned that he'd always felt drawn to ancient Egypt, had experienced dreams about living in an ancient city, and had chosen Egypt for vacation, specifically because of an inexplicable pull toward the region. Morse agreed to participate in past life regression therapy conducted by researchers. Under hypnosis, he described memories of working as a scribe in ancient Egypt, recording inventories, sealing storage vessels. He provided details about administrative procedures that matched what historians knew about ancient Egyptian record-keeping. Skeptics argued the match must be a statistical coincidence. While fingerprints are supposed to be unique, with 8 billion people alive today and countless billions who've lived throughout history, perhaps matches are more common than believed. But forensic statisticians calculated the odds. Even accounting for the entire human population across all of history, the probability of a random match remains vanishingly small, far less than the probability of being struck by lightning every day for a year. The match prints were documented in a joint paper by the Egyptian Ministry of Antiquities and forensic scientists from the University of Cairo. The paper concluded that while the match was verified, the mechanism allowing two individuals separated by 3,300 years to have identical fingerprints remained unknown. The Spanish Inquisition ledger. In 1994, researchers at the Archive of the Crown of Aragon in Barcelona were digitizing historical documents, including records from the Spanish Inquisition. One ledger from 1492 contained lists of names, charges, and sentences, and numerous fingerprints from the inquisitors who had handled the pages. The fingerprints were preserved in ink and oils transferred from the inquisitors' hands to the paper. Modern imaging techniques could capture these prints in detail sufficient for forensic analysis. As part of a research project studying historical fingerprints, the prints from the Inquisition ledger were cataloged and analyzed. The project created a database of prints from various historical periods to study how fingerprint patterns might have changed across populations over time. In 2004, a Spanish woman named Isabella Ruiz was arrested for shoplifting in Barcelona. Her fingerprints were taken and entered into Spain's National Criminal Database. The database, which includes auxiliary research files from various institutions, flagged a match to the historical fingerprint database. Ruiz's fingerprints matched those of one of the inquisitors who had handled the 1492 ledger, a complete match across all 10 fingers. Police initially assumed a data entry error, but forensic examination confirmed the match was real. Ruiz's modern prints were identical to 5 12-year-old prints from the Inquisition ledger. Investigators verified there was no way Ruiz could have contaminated the historical document. The ledger had been in the archive since the 16th century, never leaving secure storage. Ruiz had never visited the archive, never worked with historical documents, never had access to the material. The ledger had been digitized in 1994, a decade before Ruiz was fingerprinted. The historical prints were documented and photographed before any possibility of contamination by Ruiz. When Ruiz was informed about the match, she reacted with horror. She'd grown up in Barcelona with a strong aversion to the Spanish Inquisition. She'd always found the history disturbing in ways she couldn't explain. She'd avoided certain old buildings in Barcelona that had Inquisition connections, saying they made her feel guilty and afraid. Researchers investigated Ruiz's family history. Her family had been in Barcelona for many generations. In the 1490s, during the height of the Inquisition, many families kept records of their genealogy to prove limpieza de sangre, purity of blood. Some of Ruiz's distant ancestors appeared in these records. Among the historical documents, researchers found references to a family named Ruiz that had been prominent in Barcelona in the 1490s. One member of this family had served as an official in the Inquisition tribunal, the same tribunal that produced the ledger bearing the matched fingerprints. But proving this historical Ruiz was an ancestor didn't explain identical fingerprints. Even direct genetic descent wouldn't transfer fingerprint patterns. Ruiz participated in psychological evaluation and hypnotic regression. Under hypnosis, she described memories of interrogating prisoners, recording confessions, making decisions about heretics' fates. She became extremely distressed during these sessions, crying and asking for forgiveness for what I did. The details she provided matched historical records of Inquisition procedures. She described the layout of interrogation rooms, the documents used, the administrative processes, details not widely known to the public. Parapsychologists studying the case proposed that Ruiz carried memories from a past life as an inquisitor, and somehow also carried the biological marker of fingerprints. Skeptics argued this was impossible and that the match must involve some error in documentation or analysis. But multiple independent forensic examiners verified the match. The prints were identical. The historical prints were genuinely from the 15th century, and no contamination had occurred. Ruiz eventually moved away from Barcelona, saying she couldn't bear living in a city with so many reminders of the Inquisition. The matched prints remain in the archive of the Crown of Aragon's research database, documented but unexplained. The French Revolution document. In 2001, the Archives Nationales in Paris was processing documents from the French Revolution when conservators discovered fingerprints on a 1793 warrant for arrest. The document had been signed by Jean-Paul Marat, one of the revolution's most radical leaders, shortly before his assassination. The fingerprints were well preserved in ink on the paper. They weren't Marat's. They were from an unknown official who had handled the document, likely a clerk or assistant. In 2015, a Frenchman named Lucien Girard was fingerprinted as part of a background check for government employment. His prints were entered into France's national fingerprint database, FAED, Fichier Automatisé des Empreintes Digitales. The system flagged a match to prints in a historical research database maintained by the Archives Nationales. Girard's prints matched those on the 1793 arrest warrant, identical across all 10 fingers. French police investigated, assuming some error. But Forensic examination confirmed the match. The historical prints were genuinely 222 years old. The paper aging, ink chemistry, and preservation conditions all confirmed the document's authenticity and age. Gerard's prints were unquestionably his, taken in 2015. Gerard had never visited the Archives Nationales. He'd never worked with historical documents. He had no connection to revolutionary history beyond standard French education. There was no way he could have contaminated the 18th century document. Gerard's family had been in France for generations. Genealogical research found that his ancestors had lived in Paris during the Revolution. One ancestor appeared in records as a clerk in the revolutionary government, someone who might have handled documents exactly like the arrest warrant. But even direct descent couldn't explain identical fingerprints. When told about the match, Gerard mentioned recurring dreams he'd had throughout his life. He dreamed of revolutionary Paris, the crowds, the violence, working in government offices, fear of being denounced as a counter-revolutionary. He'd always thought these were just vivid nightmares influenced by history classes. Gerard agreed to visit the archives to see the document. When shown the arrest warrant, he became visibly emotional. He said seeing it felt like remembering something I'd tried to forget. He described the fear of working in Marat's shadow, the constant danger, the moral compromises required to survive. Researchers studying the case arranged for Gerard to undergo past life regression. Under hypnosis, he described detailed memories of working as a revolutionary clerk, processing arrest warrants, living in constant fear during the terror. He provided specific details about daily life that matched historical records. Skeptics argued that Gerard could have researched revolutionary history and incorporated it into his subconscious. But historians noted that some of the details he provided under hypnosis were obscure facts not widely known. Specific administrative procedures, the layout of government buildings, names of minor officials. The matched fingerprints were verified by forensic experts from the French National Police and independent analysts. All confirmed the impossibility of the match according to conventional understanding of fingerprint uniqueness. The case was documented in French forensic journals, but received little public attention. Gerard declined media interviews, preferring privacy. The arrest warrant remains in the Archives Nationales, with notation in its catalog entry about the matching prints. The Salem witch trial record. In 2009, historians at the Peabody Essex Museum in Salem, Massachusetts, were digitizing documents from the 1692 Salem witch trials. Among these documents were original court records bearing fingerprints from the judges, clerks, and officials who had handled them during the trials. The fingerprints were preserved in ink, wax, and oils from the handlers' fingers. Modern forensic imaging captured these prints in detail, suitable for analysis. In 2016, a Massachusetts woman named Rebecca Stone was fingerprinted for a teaching license. Her prints were entered into the Massachusetts State Criminal Database, which includes auxiliary research files from various institutions. The database flagged a match. Stone's fingerprints were identical to those of a court clerk who had handled documents during the Salem witch trials in 1692, 324 years earlier. The Massachusetts State Police Forensic Laboratory investigated. They verified the match was accurate. Stone's prints were identical to the historical prints across all 10 fingers. The witch trial documents had been in museum storage since the 19th century, carefully preserved and rarely handled. Stone had never visited the museum's archives, never handled any witch trial materials, never had contact with the documents. Stone's family had deep roots in Massachusetts, dating back to colonial times. Genealogical research found that one of Stone's ancestors had lived in Salem in the 1690s and had worked as a court clerk. Historical records suggested this ancestor had been involved in recording the witch trial proceedings. When Stone was told about the fingerprint match, she reacted with what she described as recognition mixed with horror. She'd grown up in Massachusetts with an inexplicable aversion to Salem, despite never visiting. She'd always avoided learning about the witch trials because the subject made her feel guilty and responsible in ways she couldn't understand. Stone agreed to participate in research on the phenomenon. Under hypnotic regression, she described memories of recording testimonies, writing down accusations, feeling moral anguish about the trials while being unable to stop them. She became extremely distressed, apologizing repeatedly for failing to prevent injustice. The details she provided matched historical records. She described the courthouse layout, the judges' names, specific procedures used during the trials, details consistent with historical documentation. Researchers from Harvard Medical School studied Stone's case, proposing it as potential evidence of biological memory transfer across generations. But conventional genetics couldn't explain how fingerprints, which develop randomly during fetal growth, could be inherited. Stone eventually moved to California, saying she needed distance from Massachusetts and its history. She changed her career from teaching to counseling, saying she wanted to help people in ways she hadn't been able to before. The matched prints were documented in the Peabody Essex Museum's research archives. They represent either a statistical impossibility or evidence of something that challenges our understanding of identity, memory, and the relationship between past and present. The World War I Correspondence. In 2003, military historians in Belgium were cataloging letters and documents from World War I, found in an attic during renovation of a building that had served as a military hospital. Among the documents were letters written by soldiers bearing fingerprints in ink and mud. One letter, dated November 1917, was from a British soldier named William Crawford, written to his wife just days before he was killed in action at Passchendaele. The letter bore clear fingerprints, preserved in mud that had dried on the paper over 86 years. In 2005, a British man named William Crawford, same name as the WWI soldier, was fingerprinted during a security clearance for employment with a defense contractor. His prints were entered into the UK's national database. The system flagged a match to prints in a military history archive maintained by the Imperial War Museum. The modern William Crawford's prints matched those on the 1917 letter from the WWI soldier William Crawford. Forensic examination confirmed the match was accurate. The historical prints were genuinely from 1917. The paper aging, mud composition, and ink chemistry all confirmed the letter's age. The modern prints were unquestionably from the living William Crawford. There was no possibility of contamination. The letter had been sealed in an attic since 1918, discovered in 2003, and immediately placed in archival storage. The modern William Crawford had never visited Belgium, never seen the letter, never had contact with WWI materials. Genealogical research revealed something extraordinary. The modern William Crawford was the great-great-nephew of the WWI soldier William Crawford. The families were directly connected, though the line didn't descend through the WWI soldier. He'd died at age 24 with no children. But even family connection couldn't explain identical fingerprints across 4 generations of separation. When the modern Crawford learned about the match, he described a lifelong fascination with World War I, particularly the Battle of Passchendaele. He'd visited the battlefield in Belgium several times, feeling inexplicably drawn to it, despite having no family connection he knew of. He'd also experienced recurring nightmares about trench warfare, the mud, the cold, the constant fear, the sound of artillery. He'd sought therapy for these dreams in his 20s, before knowing anything about his WWI ancestor. Crawford agreed to view the 1917 letter. When he read it, he became emotional, saying certain phrases felt like thoughts I've had, but never written down. The letter described the mud, the fear, hopes of returning home, sentiments that matched Crawford's dreams. Under hypnotic regression, Crawford described detailed memories of WWI trench life. He provided specific information about the conditions at Passchendaele, the unit organization, the days leading up to the battle, details that matched historical records of the WWI, William Crawford's regiment. Researchers from Cambridge University studied the case, exploring theories of genetic memory and reincarnation. Skeptics noted that Crawford's extensive interest in WWI meant he could have absorbed historical knowledge that influenced his dreams and regression memories. But the fingerprint match couldn't be explained by psychological factors. Multiple forensic experts verified the prints were identical. The historical prints were genuinely from 1917, and no contamination was possible. The case was documented in military history journals. The letter remains in the Imperial War Museum's collection with notation about the impossible fingerprint match. Crawford visited the museum to see the letter displayed in its WWI exhibit, standing silently before it for nearly an hour. These 10 cases represent documented instances where fingerprints have matched across impossible time spans, from decades to millennia. Each case challenges the fundamental principle of fingerprint science: absolute uniqueness. Fingerprints are the gold standard of forensic identification used in criminal justice worldwide. The entire system depends on the premise that no two people can have identical fingerprints. Yet these cases, verified by multiple independent forensic experts, prove that premise is either wrong or incomplete. Skeptics argue these must be documentation errors or statistical anomalies. But in each case, the historical prints were authenticated, modern prints confirmed, and contamination ruled out. The odds of random matches remain astronomically low, far beyond what probability predicts even across all of human history. The most disturbing pattern: nearly all these individuals reported dreams, memories, or inexplicable knowledge about the historical periods where their matched predecessors lived. Sarah Mitchell dreamed of Victorian London. Marco Esposito dreamed of Pompeii's destruction. Thomas Harrington felt connected to Whitechapel. This suggests something beyond coincidence. Parapsychologists propose these cases as evidence of reincarnation, that identity transcends individual lifetimes, leaving biological traces. Mainstream science rejects this, noting fingerprints form through random fetal development and cannot be inherited. Yet the matches remain documented and verified. Either fingerprints aren't as unique as we've believed, undermining forensic systems worldwide, or something about identity and time is more complex than current science accommodates. These matched fingerprints sit in archives and databases around the world, connecting living people to those who died long ago. They're documented impossibilities that challenge everything we think we know about identity and raise the disturbing possibility that we might not be as separate from the past as we believe.